Stories, Philippines podcast.
Stands impossibly tall, a testament to steel, concrete, and ambition. You look up at the gleaming facade of a new skyscraper, a convention center, or a massive bridge, and you see progress. You see the future. But what if the true foundation of that structure wasn't just crushed stone and cement? What if it was built on something much softer, much warmer, and much more human? Imagine a vast dark hole in the earth, the first grave of a monolith. Imagine the frantic, rushed energy of a massive construction site. Under the cover of night, the air thick with the smell of wet concrete and fear. And then imagine a single, helpless person, a beggar, a child, or a worker who was too tired or too poor to fight back, being led or perhaps even thrown into that foundational pit. The cement mixer whirls its final load, thick and gray, covering a life in a rush of bubbles and dust. The legend says this is not a crime but an insurance policy. A spectral sacrifice to the earth spirits, the forgotten deities of the soil, ensuring that the building would never fall, that its pillars would stand straight and strong, protected by the very soul they had stolen. You walk into that gleaming lobby or drive across that sturdy span, never knowing the price, but sometimes, in the dead quiet of the night, a security guard hears a child crying from the basement, or an engineer sees a fleeting shadow near the support column. It's the ghost of the sacrifice, forever bound to the stone, the unseen architect who paid the ultimate price for our progress. I am Paul, and you are listening to Stories Philippines podcast. Welcome to a bonus episode of Stories Philippines. It's Tuesday, January 25, 2005. In our main episodes, we've explored the serpentine darkness lurking beneath the modern conveniences of the mall and the ancestral dread held within old family homes. Today, we're going deeper beneath the foundations, into the bedrock of our modern, man-made world, to talk about a story so dark, it whispers of murder for stability, of human life sacrificed for structural integrity. This is the enduring legend of the Pillar Man, or the Blood Sacrifice, a powerful Filipino urban legend that ties the very worst of human cruelty to the very best of human engineering. This is a story that has global echoes, mind you. Go to Europe and you'll find tales from centuries past of foundation sacrifices in places like Germany and the British Isles, where a child or an animal was buried beneath a castle wall or a bridge to make the structure last. But in the Philippines, this dark belief took on a terrifyingly modern edge in the post-war era during the massive, frantic building boom of the 1970s and 1980s. In those years, the skyline of Metro Manila began its dizzying, jagged ascent. Under a politically centralized government, major infrastructure projects, grand hotels, massive convention centers, colossal bridges, and sprawling government complexes were being built at a breakneck pace. This rush was fueled by a desire to show the world a powerful, modern nation, a new society. But the speed and the centralized power created the perfect conditions for dark rumors to flourish. The question that gnawed at the public's mind was simple. How could these gigantic buildings be put up so quickly without divine or, in this case, diabolical intervention? The answer the streets provided was the legend of the Padugo, the person in the pillar. The story goes that to prevent a new building from collapsing due to poor planning, bad materials, or supernatural attack, the spirits of the earth, the ones who would naturally resent the intrusion of concrete and steel, demanded a life. The spirit of the land would only be appeased by the sacrifice of a pure soul, often a child, a beggar, or a person with little connection to society whose disappearance would go unnoticed. This sacrifice wasn't just to appease a deity, it was a way to bind a powerful, protective ghost to the structure, a spectral guardian that would fight off earthquakes, typhoons, and the jealous magic of others. Let's look at a case that terrified a generation. It happened in the 1970s during the construction of a massive, opulent complex intended to be the jewel of Philippine cultural achievement. We'll call the young man involved Danilo Alcaraz, a 19-year-old student who was working at the construction site during his break to help his family. Danilo was saving up to return to university, a bright, hardworking young man who needed the money from the frantic 24-hour shifts. The site was a chaotic mess of mud, machinery, and exhaustion. The deadline was impossibly tight. Danilo told his friend Cecilia Reyes, a fellow worker who managed the supplies inventory, that he had a horrible feeling about the deep foundation pits. "It's not right, Celia," he whispered to her one humid afternoon. "They pour too fast. It's like they want to hide what's going down there." Celia, a pragmatic woman in her early 20s, tried to reassure him. "It's just a hurry, Danilo. They want to finish for the big event. Don't listen to the old men and their gossip." But the gossip was everywhere. Old construction veterans refused to work the midnight shift near the deepest central pillars. They spoke of bounties, offers of a large sum of money to any foreman who could secure the necessary material for the foundation. One night, Danilo was working near a giant cement mixer when he saw a strange transaction. A foreman was handing a thick envelope of cash to a man who looked like a derelict, a street scavenger. The scavenger then pointed to a child huddled asleep under a canvas tarp. Danilo couldn't see what happened next. His own foreman shouted for him to get back to work. But the chilling silence that followed where a child had been was what haunted him. 2 days later, Danilo vanished. Not a trace. No paycheck picked up, no word to Celia, and his sparse belongings left untouched in the barracks. Celia, distraught, went to the site engineer who simply shrugged, marked Danilo as having abandoned the job, and moved on. The massive structure was completed on time, a towering beacon of wealth and power, but Celia never forgot the look in Danilo's eyes. In the sound of the cement mixer on that silent night, the legend of the building's human foundation became a stain on its glamorous image, a whispered narrative that continues to this day. People who work there, security guards, cleaners, and maintenance staff, report strange things. They hear the phantom sound of a young man's cough near the basement columns. They see a fleeting figure, a shadow that disappears into the gray concrete of a central pillar, always in the same spot. It's a spectral reminder that someone, like Danilo, may have become an unwilling, unseen architect of the city's concrete dreams. This isn't a uniquely Filipino superstition. As I mentioned, the belief in sacrificial offerings for building stability is found across time and culture. In ancient Japan, it was the practice of Hyutobashira, or human pillar, where people were interred alive at the base of castles, bridges, or dams to prevent their destruction. The Maya of Central America sometimes placed ritual deposits, including human remains, in the foundations of their temples. The common thread is a profound human anxiety about permanence. When we build something enormous, something meant to defy time and nature, we feel a need to pay an enormous price to ensure its success. But in the Philippines, this belief is amplified by several unique cultural and psychological factors. First is the concept of corruption and impunity. The building boom of the 1970s and 1980s was marked by grand projects and immense governmental power, which often led to a lack of accountability and widespread rumor of misuse of funds and cutting of corners. For the average person who watched structures shoot up like weeds, it was easier to believe a life was sacrificed for stability than to believe that the building was structurally sound without oversight. The myth of the sacrifice becomes a psychological expression of the truth that the marginalized and the poor were the real victims of rapid, often brutal progress. They were the ones disappearing anyway. Second is the deep-seated respect for the earth spirits, the nature deities and ancient entities that Filipinos believe inhabit the land, trees, and water. Unlike many Western cultures that see a building site as just dirt, a Filipino often sees it as the home of an elemental being. Construction is an intrusion, a violation, and the spirits must be paid. If they aren't paid with reverence, they are paid with a human life. The story morphs, the sacrifice from a bribe to the physical building to a bribe to the offended spirit of the place. The resulting ghost, the padugo, is thus a spectral guardian serving two masters, the building and the earth spirit it died to appease. The legend achieved its most intense and notorious iteration with the story of the Manila Film Center. Built in the early 1980s, this structure was intended to host a major international film festival and needed to be completed in an almost impossible 60 days. The speed of construction was absolutely insane. Think of it. A massive, complicated architectural structure built in 2 months. The pressure on the construction crews was immense. They worked around the clock with deadlines that led to a horrifying tragedy. In November 1981, the scaffolding collapsed. The official count had a number of workers injured, but the persistent urban legend, the one whispered in hushed tones for decades, is that many laborers, between 30 and 100, were buried alive in quick-drying cement and debris. The rumors say that the political leaders, desperate to avoid a scandal and stick to the ludicrous deadline, ordered the concrete to continue pouring, sealing the dead workers into the building's foundation. The construction continued over the bodies, sacrificing the lives of the workers to the goal of the film festival. Now, whether this specific story is entirely true or a highly dramatized version of a true industrial accident is less important than the psychological impact it had on the nation. It was the perfect storm for the Padugo legend. It took the abstract fear of a ritual sacrifice and gave it a tangible, documented, horrific event. The workers weren't sacrificed to a spirit, they were sacrificed to a deadline, a political ambition, a piece of concrete. The stories from the film center are relentless. For years, people believed the building was one of the most haunted in the country. One story comes from a former janitor, Emilio Ramos, who worked the night shift in the late 1990s. The small auditorium, Emilio recounted to a relative who submitted the story to our email at storiesphpodcast@gmail.com. You can submit your own stories to our email, storiesphpodcast@gmail.com, and we might feature them in a future episode. Emilio said the auditorium was never truly dark, even when all the lights were off. I'd be mopping the floor and I'd feel a terrible cold, not air conditioning, but a cold like death right over the center aisle, he said. Then I'd hear the shuffling, like 50 or 100 men moving on the hard floor. But when I looked up, nothing, just the emptiness of the seats. And the smell, sometimes a faint, horrible smell of wet cement and something metallic. They say the ones buried there are always trying to get out, always trying to finish their shift. The structure itself, designed to be a hub of art, became a monument to architectural tragedy and a perpetual source of ghostly activity. It serves as a dark reminder that even when the official narrative says a building is complete, the people who were sacrificed for it are still bound to its steel skeleton. How do we try to make sense of a phenomenon like this, a persistent urban legend so closely tied to specific locations and dates? From a scientific and psychological perspective, the legend of the unseen architect is a classic example of legend tripping and collective anxiety. When a major tragedy occurs, like the potential burying of workers, the human mind seeks a narrative structure to explain the horror. The pre-existing Filipino folklore about appeasing earth spirits provides a ready-made framework. The trauma of the event is then processed through the cultural lens. The ghost stories become a form of moral protest. The people cannot openly protest the corruption or the lack of safety at the time, so the spirits of the dead, the ghosts, protest on their behalf, a supernatural strike against the callousness of the powerful. Furthermore, these buildings are often imposing and disorienting. They have massive labyrinthine basements, strange acoustic properties, and are often deserted at night. This environment is perfect for infrasound and misinterpretation of stimuli. A slight vibration, a creaking of the structure, or the sound of water rushing through pipes can be easily interpreted by an anxious mind as the cry of a buried spirit. Now, the theological perspective provides a different, albeit parallel, insight. In the context of a deeply Catholic nation, the act of a foundation sacrifice is seen as a profound sin against God and man. It's not just murder, it is a ritualistic act of despair that places faith in a profane contract, a pact with a demonic or earthbound power, rather than in God's providence. The Catholic Church generally views the existence of ghosts as souls in purgatory, but a soul forcibly bound to an object through an act of evil, as in the foundation sacrifice, complicates this view. It suggests a spiritual imprisonment, a violation of free will even in death. the sightings, the strange events, the cold spots, they become more than just a ghost story. They are perceived as evidence of a deep, unabsolved wickedness that has consecrated the ground not to God, but to the darker things that dwell in the earth. The structure itself becomes inherently unholy because of the original sin committed in its genesis. If you are interested in exploring the deeper cultural and spiritual implications of these stories, you might want to access exclusive content on Patreon. We have bonus interviews and deep dives into the theological history of Filipino demonology and folklore waiting for you there. The Unseen Architect isn't confined to grand buildings. The legend also finds its way to massive civil engineering projects, especially those that cross water, where the blood sacrifice legend merges with the Pillar Man story. The Siokoy are the malevolent water spirits in Filipino mythology, the male counterparts of mermaids, often depicted as grotesque and fish-like, who demand a price for allowing humans to cross their domain. Consider the construction of a major bridge, one that spans a notoriously deep and swift river, built during the 1990s. The engineering challenges were immense, and the foundation required massive, deep pilings to be sunk into the riverbed. A worker on this project, whom we'll call Ricardo Pineda, told us a story of a day when the construction was repeatedly delayed. Every time the crew tried to drop a steel casing for a major column into the water, the cable would mysteriously snap or the drilling machinery would break. It was more than bad luck. It was a pattern. The foremen were furious. They brought a man they called a babaylan, a kind of local shaman, to the site. Ricardo explained. This man didn't look at the river, he looked at the water. He said the spirit of the deep was angry. It didn't want the bridge, and it wouldn't let the foundation hold. It was demanding a payment. The shaman's payment wasn't coins or a pig. He said the water spirit required a life, one that could become its spectral servant, protecting the pillars from the crushing water pressure. A few days later, a homeless man known to sleep on the riverbank disappeared. He was a familiar, harmless figure, but when his usual spot was empty for a week, everyone assumed he'd simply moved on. But Ricardo and a few others noticed something unsettling. The day after the man disappeared, the palings went in smoothly. Every drill held, every cable remained intact. The river, which had been tempestuous, grew still around the site. Ricardo, now in his 60s and living far from the river, remains convinced the bridge is sturdy. It has survived all the typhoons, but sometimes when I see a photo of it, I just know that its strength is not just in the steel. It's held up by a man who now serves the water demon, a blood sacrifice bound to the base of a concrete column. This story is a powerful cultural expression of a very real fear, the fear that progress is often paid for by the most vulnerable among us. The concrete jungles we call cities are marvels of human ingenuity, but they are also monuments to collective fear and sometimes to individual tragedy. The legend of the Unseen Architect forces us to ask a difficult question about the nature of our ambition. When we rush to build something great, something enormous, what is the true hidden cost? Is it possible for a structure to absorb the terror and the violence of its creation, leaving a psychic residue that manifests as a haunting? We walk over these bridges, we shop in these malls, we work in these towers, all designed to be symbols of stability and modernity. But beneath the polished marble, in the darkness of the deepest basement, the legend whispers that the concrete is not just holding up the structure, it's holding down a soul. And that soul is perpetually trying to escape, forever reminding us of the dark exchange that took place when the foundations were laid. As you reflect on the structures in your own city, I encourage you to follow us on social media for daily folklore facts that might shine a light on the hidden stories of your own neighborhood. Thank you for listening to this bonus episode of Stories Philippines. Was the rapid development of the mid-20th century truly too fast, too corrupt, to be physically sound without a sacrifice? Or is the tale of the Unseen Architect simply the heartbreaking way we process the disappearance of the poor and the tragedy of industrial accidents? We'll continue to explore the shadows of Filipino history and folklore in our next episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, and share this podcast with a friend who might enjoy a good chill. If you want to support the research and production of stories like this, you can find various ways to support the podcast financially in ways you can find in the show notes. Join us again next time for more untold tales from the archipelago.